Lesson 10, Part 1, Palamas and Latin Theology. In this lecture, which is the first of two parts for this lesson, we will look at the state of the question with respect to the supposed non-compatibility or compatibility between Eastern Byzantine theology, understood in terms of the teaching and spirituality of St. Gregory Palamas, and the overall Latin tradition. We will look at especially the various avenues of seeking philosophical and theological reconciliation between Palamas and the Western tradition by considering how Palamas has been viewed in relation to the Thomistic system and especially St. Thomas's reception of St. Augustine. And then we will also look at avenues of compatibility and dialogue between the Palamite school and the West in terms of the compatibilities between, or potential compatibilities between, Palamas's teaching on especially the essence-energies distinction and the Franciscan school's understanding of the formal distinction as it relates to our understanding of God and how God is manifested to us, and the intrinsic or positive infinity of the divine being. So in looking at this question between Palamas and Latin theology, we will first try to establish the state of the question, and then in terms of establishing the state of the question, we will look at, with some depth, although not exhaustive depth, the nature of the dispute between, or the apparent dispute between East and West on the importance and status of Palamas's teaching, or Palamism. So in this first part, we will be looking at the overall background of the dispute, giving a kind of general summary, by no means exhaustive, but rather trying to adequately lay out what are perceived as the problems and the remaining obstacles between East and West on the status and place of Palamas in the East and its compatibility with the Western theological tradition. This is important because Palamas is considered, or the teachings of Palamas on the essence-energies distinction, and then the related spirituality bound up in the practice known as hesychasm. This teaching and spirituality is considered dogmatic in the Byzantine East, and thus if there's going to be any theological and broader ecumenical rapprochement between the Latin West and the Byzantine East, there will have to be a way of seeing the compatibility and harmony between the theology and spirituality of Gregory Palamas and his disciples and the broader theological and spiritual tradition of the Latin West. So in this first part, we will be looking mainly at the main issues of dispute, looking briefly at the history of this dispute, and then spending a bit more time looking at contemporary figures in this discussion between East and West. And then in part two, we will move more directly into the theoretical considerations, emphasizing the points of continuity between Palamas and the Franciscan school, especially in the Franciscan masters St. Bonaventure of Bagnoregio and Blessed John Duns Scotus. So briefly, just to point out the state of the question, without in any way attempting to give a full account of either Palamas' theology or the Latin West's various theological strands in a systematic or scholarly manner, our efforts in this lesson will be just simply to get an overview, to get a basic handle on what are the main issues and main contentions going back and forth between the Byzantine theological tradition and certain more prominent representatives of the Western or Latin theological tradition. So by beginning with the state of the question, we first can offer a couple of quotes by Christopher Schneider, the editor of Divine Essence and Divine Energies, the compilation of essays from a symposium back in 2008, I believe, held at the University of Cambridge, dealing with this specific topic of Palamasm and the interaction and interrelation between Eastern Byzantine Palamasm and Western Latin Thomism, especially. And more particularly, the symposium was held as the occasion to honor the very important and quite good work of the American professor of philosophy at the University of Kentucky, David Bradshaw's work, Aristotle, East and West, published by Cambridge University Press back in 2004. And this work sparked a great deal of praise, but also some criticism, as we will see going forward in this lecture. It is important to note, though, that one of the fundamental contentions of Bradshaw is that the West, in its Thomistic philosophical theology, especially with respect to the being and attributes of God, is incoherent and devolves or reduces to a kind of monistic necessitarianism. The understanding of divine simplicity offered by St. Thomas Aquinas is, according to Bradshaw, an understanding that renders creation ex nihilo impossible because it renders free action in God impossible by dint of what Bradshaw sees as the collapsing of God's energies, especially his energy of will, into simply the divine being. So if the divine being is necessary and the divine will is the divine being, then the divine will be necessary. Thus, if necessary, then creating with necessity. And so Bradshaw sees this as a very important point in the debate or dispute on levels of metaphysics and dogma between the Byzantine East and the Palamite tradition and the Latin West and the Augustiniano Thomistic tradition. And he posits in place of this Augustinian Thomistic understanding of divine simplicity the Palamite distinction between essence and energies. And this brings us to the point of the pertinence of the two quotes on our page here. And these quotes again come from Schneider, but they sum up the general position of Bradshaw with respect to the impassable divide between East and West, between Palamas and St. Thomas, and these quotes also represent the growing, or at least, if not absolute, but at least dominant consensus of especially Eastern Orthodox theologians with respect to the West, and the irreducible distinction between the Byzantine theological tradition and the Latin Thomistic theological tradition. So, quoting Schneider, we can say, for For most contemporary Orthodox theologians, the distinction between the divine essence and energies belongs to the very core of the Orthodox tradition and has no direct equivalent in the West. Well, this simply says that the heart of Eastern dogmatic theology lay in the essence-energies distinction, and the essence-energies distinction is utterly different than anything we find in the West. Thus, the very heart of the Eastern Byzantine understanding of God is essentially different from the West. Going on the next page, Schneider writes, David Bradshaw, Konstantinos Athanasopoulos, and Nicholas Ludovicus share the view that the essence-energies distinction is a key doctrine without parallel in the West. And so it's very clear the fundamental position of Orthodox theologians, at least in the majority, hold that the East is essentially distinct with the West, and the West has no counterpart to Palamas. Moreover, the Western understanding, which is taken to be identical with St. Thomas's understanding of simplicity, is simply incorrect, incoherent, and presents an impassable obstacle between Eastern and Western theological consensus and ecumenical unity. Obviously, I think this isn't the full story, because I do think there is sufficient theological evidence in the West to show there are counterparts to Palamas's understanding between the essence-energies distinction in the West, especially in the Franciscan school. Second, the question remains whether Palamas ever clearly expressed his own teaching with respect to the nature of the distinction between the essence and energies of God. Third, there is the question of whether or not Eastern Orthodox scholars who favor Palamas and rightly criticize certain deficiencies in St. Thomas ever themselves present a coherent and consistent account of the distinction between essence and energies. And then fourth, the seemingly ubiquitous collapsing of the Latin theological tradition into the Augustino Thomistic theological tradition, as though the latter was coextensive with the former. All four of these issues remain and demand clarification. And in this lecture, and in the following lecture, we hope to, at least, if not directly, implicitly reply or respond to each of these particular questions, and thereby hoping to show that Palamas is not simply incompatible with Western theology, and Western theology isn't simply devoid of the important and essential insights of St. Gregory Palamas with respect to metaphysics, dogmatic theology, and spirituality. So in the next several slides, we'll be looking at, well, what's the big deal what's the big deal concerning the Palamite essence-energies distinction? So in the first place, then, we have to ask, well, why did Palamas emphasize this distinction between essence and energy? How did this work? How did this arise? And what was the theological and philosophical antecedents of this distinction on the one hand, and then what are the implications on the other hand? Well, in the first place, then, Palamas just briefly developed and applied his distinction in God between God's incomprehensible and ineffable essence and God's energies in reply to criticisms, especially flowing from Ba'arlam the Calabrian, that denied the hesychastic mode of prayer that was practiced in monastic settings was valid. Palamas, on the basis of the presumption that these monastics were holy men and were really experiencing what they were purporting to experience, came to their defense and argued on the basis of this distinction that their spirituality, that is, this hesychastic spirituality, is valid and sound, and in fact is the spirituality that Jesus conferred to his apostles at the beginning of the church, and in fact is the same reality that the prophets experienced and patriarchs experienced in the Old Testament. So then what is hesychasm, or what does it purport to teach? Well, without getting into the specifics of hesychasm and, in a sense, the method of hesychastic prayer, in a nutshell, hesychasm posited that in the highest form of prayer, the individual believer participates in and experiences in some real and what one might say empirical manner the uncreated light of God, the light of Tabor, the light that was manifested to the three apostles on the holy mountain of transfiguration. On the one hand, then, Palamas wanted to defend the authenticity of the experience of the holy monks in the context of hesychastic prayer, while on the other hand, and he wanted to defend this naturally against those who would criticize this, he wanted to defend its reality against those who would diminish it and attribute this kind of experience to psychological projection or an overheated imagination. But this created a kind of dilemma for St. Gregory, because these monks purported to see, in some manner, to see the uncreated light of God. Well, if the light is uncreated, it's divine, but if it's seen, it's somehow able to be known and experienced by human beings. And thus the paradox, or rather the dilemma, came in affirming the uncreatedness of this divine light and the createdness or reality of some sort of empirical experience of this uncreated light by the hesychast. And this is simply because Palamas, with the entirety of the Eastern tradition, affirms that God's essence is infinite and thus incomprehensible. It's unknowable. The essence in itself of God cannot be known or properly named. And this is very clear in Book 1 of the Damascenes de Fide Orthodoxa. So thus, on the one hand, one is affirming that this light that is experienced is uncreated, and yet on the other hand, what can't be experienced is being experienced by these monks. So there has to be a way of distinguishing what is experienced by the monks from the essence of God. Well, this flows out then, or what flows out naturally, is a distinction between the infinite, ineffable, and unknowable essence of God and the uncreated divine energies that manifest the essence or substance of God outside of himself, and in terms of this manifestation are also able to be participated by those who experience these energies. And for a further background on the historical and theological antecedents in the Greek patristic tradition, one could look at Jean-Claude Larcher's La Théologie des Énergies Divines, from the origin of the Greek tradition to St. John Damascene. And this was published in French back in 2010, 10, but it's a massive 500-page book giving all of the primary texts and interspersed commentary on these texts of the entire Eastern tradition and the way that this distinction between the divine essence and the divine energies has been carried out and developed. Although in St. Gregory Palamas, in the context of the hesychast controversy, this distinction took on unique and central importance and emphasis. So that's, so much for the historical background and debate, which would go on from the 1330s all the way up to the 1340s and 50s, when the Fifth Council of Constantinople, or what is known by some in the East as the Ninth Ecumenical Council, declared against Barlaam and Prochorus Cedones in favor of Palamas's essence energies distinction. And so now from our vantage point, what is the nature of, or the question remains about the nature of the distinction in God between essence and energies, because as we saw in the Damascene, God is not compounded of parts. He is not composed of entities that are prior to himself, out of which his being comes, as is the case, however, with material substances that are composed of matter and form. And so this distinction that is beyond just connotative and conventional names that we give to God because of our limitation. This distinction that seems to be in God, or seems to describe God's very being prior to any activity of the mind in coming to know God, at least in terms of his manifestations, his energies. What is the nature of this distinction? And in the wake of Aristotelian philosophy, especially in the West, in terms of receiving or understanding Palamas's distinction, his essence energies distinction seems to fit only under one of three possible categories, either a real, a formal, or a virtual distinction. So in God is this distinction, given that God is not made up of parts, nor is his essence separable from his energies, is this distinction a real distinction, a formal distinction, or a virtual or mental distinction? Or is it simply none of the above? And what we find here is that there are scholars who will try to argue for especially one or another of the first two distinctions, that is, the real and formal distinction. Yet there is no clear and absolute consensus on what the nature of Palamas's real distinction between essence and energies is in his own teaching. And in some ways one might question whether or not Palamas ever himself developed a coherent account and a consistent account of this distinction. So just basically a brief run through then of the three kinds of distinction that are usually considered to be on the table when trying to understand Palamas's distinction in God between essence and energies. First, there's the option for a real distinction. And a real distinction implies independence of two distinct entities or existences and or their separability. So if there is a real distinction between, say, an individual's two hands, then it would imply that these two hands can operate independently of one another qua hands, and these two hands can be separated. Now, separability is not an exclusive or universal criterion for a real distinction, because we have in the three persons of the Trinity clear independence of existence. That is, each is uniquely a termination or a hypostasis of the divine being, which is itself independent and infinite. Yet, these three persons, because of the identity they have in the one divine being, are in no wise separable. So, a real distinction implies independence of existence and or actual separability. And some people posit that this is the kind of understanding that Palamas had with respect to the difference between, or distinction in God between essence and energy. But I think, as we will discover in the second lecture of this lesson, that this is not a correct understanding, and it actually says or implies too much. It would render God divided in his being. The second option, which finds supporters both East and West, affirms that there is a real or radical identity of two distinct quiddities or realities. But yet this distinction and their distinctness is prior to the activity of any mind knowing it. So, for example, a formal distinction may be in God the distinction between simply his divine intellect and divine will. Now, because God is uncompounded and he's perfect and infinite, there can be no separation between God's intellect and will, but in terms of the definition of the power of intellect and will, intellect is simply irreducible to will because its mode of operation manifests itself and, in a sense, imposes itself in its distinctness. That is, the distinctness between intellect and its mode of operation and will and its mode of operation. These manifest themselves and impose themselves on the mind, and the mind recognizes them. So the formal distinction is a recognition of irreducible essences or quiddities within a single, really identical being. Another example may be in the human person. A similar distinction obtains between the soul and its powers, and between the powers themselves. There is a real there's not a real distinction between the soul and its powers. Rather, the powers of the soul simply are the soul in terms of the soul's manifestation or operation. And the three modes of operation of memory, intellect, and will are not simply identical. In fact, intellection, for example, and volition, for example, are irreducible to one another. You can in no way define intellection in terms of volition and vice versa. So rather, there's a distinction between the powers of the soul that imply difference or non-identity in terms of quiddity, but do not negate the radical or real identity of each of these powers with the soul, and thus with the soul and in the soul with one another. So a formal distinction is a real distinction insofar as two entities or two quiddities are irreducible to one another, and the difference is prior to the mind's activity. So it's not just simply the mind acting in order to understand and imposing distinctions and difference. It's rather prior to the activity of the mind. Yet, these different quiddities or realities are not independent of one another, nor are they separable. So thus, with respect to the divine intellect and divine will, or closer to home, the created intellect and created will, there there's a distinction that's real and prior to the operation of the human mind in coming to understand them, and the distinction itself imposes, or the realities themselves impose the distinction upon the mind, on the one hand. Yet, these distinct realities or operations are in no way independent of one another, nor are they separable. So you can't simply separate the intellect from the will and still have an intellect, nor can you separate the will from the intellect and still have a will. And moreover, neither can act simply independently. The intellect is always purposively oriented towards a volitional stance, towards what is known, and the will can never simply will in isolation from what the intellect provides. And so other scholars, East and West, see the Palamite distinction between essence and energies best understood in terms of a formal distinction. And the formal distinction develops out of the Franciscan school with its roots in St. Bonaventure, as we will see in the following lecture, and its ultimate kind of, in a sense, terminal clarification in the writings of Duns Scotus. And then finally, there's what is called a virtual or mental distinction. And this is a real identity and a distinction imposed by the mind. Thus, the distinction one sees in a virtual distinction is simply a kind of heuristic or hermeneutical move by the one who would want to know in order to help him understand one single entity more clearly. Such a formal distinction could be seen in terms of, or rather, virtual distinction, could be seen in terms of, for example, when considering a ball, one can consider the circularity of the ball distinctly from its spherical nature, yet one can simply, in this example of the ball, not create any formal or real distinction between the sphericity of a ball and its circularity. Rather, the circularity or diameter, perhaps, can be considered in a way to better understand the nature of a sphere, or vice versa. Considering a sphere can help one better understand the nature of a circle. But in either case, the prior concept of circularity cannot be really or even formally distinct from the concept of a ball as such. Another way of considering a virtual distinction with the same example would be by considering the ball as visible and the ball as not invisible, but not able to be seen. So you could divide the ball into what is manifest and what is implied, and you can, in a sense, then posit a kind of back side of the ball in virtue of the front side, but in its spherical nature, there isn't properly a front or a back. It's rather I'm making a virtual distinction between the front and the back to better serve my understanding of the ball and its position, or its relation to my perception here and now. So in sum, the virtual distinction is real identity and distinction only imposed by the mind for the sake of the knower, rather than real identity and distinction in the single entity imposing itself upon the mind from and by the nature of the reality itself. And then finally, an option is that the Palamite essence-energies distinction doesn't really fit under any of these three distinctions, the real, formal, or mental or virtual distinctions. And I think this is this notion, or this theory, is least credible because, on the one hand, it seems difficult to conceive of a distinction that doesn't fall under one of these three main categories. And also, in the absence of considering the Palamite essence energies distinction under one of the three aspects or of distinction that is real, formal, and virtual, there doesn't seem to be any forthcoming explanation of the nature of the distinction that Palamas draws between the essence and energies in God that has any explanatory power. So it simply becomes a question of whether or not positing a distinction is meaningful at all in the absence of being able to specify and explain what the nature of that distinction is. So in the first place, what's the big deal is Palamas's teaching on the distinction in God between essence and energies is a fundamental metaphysical and theological disjunct or way of understanding God that is rooted in real historical spiritual experience and has implications for how we understand theoretically and explain in a coherent manner what God is in himself and the manner in which he interacts with and brings creatures in relation to himself. A second aspect of what's the big deal over Palamas's essence energies distinction is based in the fact that Palamas's distinction, his theology, and his defense of the holy hesychasts has taken on dogmatic authority for Byzantine Christians. And this dogmatic authority is founded upon and centered in especially the Fifth Council of Constantinople, or rather what became known as the Fifth Council of Constantinople, or also known as the Ninth Ecumenical Council. And this Fifth Council, or Ninth Council, depending on how you want to consider it, is really the culmination of a series of synods that commenced in the early 1340s and reached their conclusion or term in 1351. And this is interesting because Palamas himself was born in 1296 and he died in 1357. So, beginning with the writings of Barlaam and his criticisms of the holy hesychasts in the 1330s, and then being carried on in the 1350s, well, especially 40s, by Kidones, Palamas lived his life writing and reflecting and praying about the nature of this distinction in response and in reaction to Byzantine Christians who would deny the coherency, the validity, and the orthodoxy of this distinction between essence and energies. And then Palamas was vindicated in his own lifetime by the declaration, or rather declarations of the Fifth Council of Constantinople in 1351. So having covered a bit in the earlier slide about the nature of the distinction between, or what's at issue and what's at stake in this distinction between the essence and energies in the divine being, we can state that then the big deal for our purposes now and also for the historic history of the dispute lay in the nature of Palamas's teaching, the teaching that says that the hesychasts were being literally honest, and their teaching and practice is literally true insofar as they claim to experience the uncreated light as, in a sense, the fruition or terminus of their form of prayer. And the nature of the teaching, then, this distinction, this affirmation that there is a non-psychologically non-epistemically imposed distinction in God between his essence and his energies or manifestations, his uncreated energies or manifestations, is at the heart of, or became situated at the very center and heart of, Byzantine dogmatic theology and spirituality. So now let's look at some reactions and criticisms of Gregory Palamas. Well, historically, and we've already alluded to these, Palamas's doctrine was attacked initially by Barlaam, the Calabrian, in the 1330s, and then later by the Byzantine Thomist Prochorus Chidones in the 1340s and 50s in the East. And essentially, the distinction or the problem lay in, on the one hand, Palamas's more optimistic understanding that, yes, God's energies and thus God himself can be known and can be discussed, which seems to be a kind of optimistic cataphatic theology. And in fact, Palamas says that we participate in our theosis in these energies. We take on a kind of divine quality, an uncreated quality, in participating in these various divine energies. So Barlaam thought this was simply overly optimistic and presumptuous to think that anything positive can be said about God's energies, and that God's energies or essence can be known at all. On the other hand, with Chidones, you have a typical Byzantine, typical Thomistic critique insofar as the distinction between the essence and energies. Rather, any real and objective distinction in God at all posited by theologians is illegitimate because it violates God's uncompoundedness or simplicity. In the West, in more recent times, but even in past centuries, such as in the dogmatic theology of Dionysius Petavius, a 17th century theologian, the criticism of Palamas always was that Palamas violates divine simplicity. His teaching, his distinction, his, quote, real, unquote, distinction between the divine essence and energies is a clear violation of divine simplicity, and thus must be false because it implies a kind of pantheism. On the one hand, if all creatures really participate in God, in an uncreated energy on the one hand, or it either makes God not God, because God is, in a sense, diffused into all of creation indiscriminately, and there can be then no radical transcendence of the divine being. And this criticism already goes back to the preconciliar schema of the Council of Florence, wherein the Dominicans, especially in the person of John of Montenero, argued vehemently, and then following John of Montenero, the famous or perhaps infamous Torquemada, both figures argued vehemently against the Palamite distinction and called for its denunciation. On the other hand, it wasn't the Dominicans who were given control of the discussion between East and West at the Council of Florence on the divine being in se, or the divine being ad intra. It was rather the Franciscans who were given charge of this, and the outcome, at least in the initial schema, was much more irenic, and the Franciscans saw no essential incompatibility with the teachings of Palamas as mediated through especially Mark of Ephesus and Gennadius Scholarius, Mark of Ephesus's hand-picked successor. The Franciscans saw no essential incompatibility and thus fought against and, in fact, whether directly or indirectly, prevented the condemnation so desired by the Dominicans of the Palamas theological metaphysics of the divine being ad intra. So rooted in this recognition or compatibility between the theological and philosophical approach to the divine being as that one finds in Scotus and also Bonaventure, that was recognized by figures such as the already mentioned Dionysius Petavius in the 17th century, and then by 20th century scholars such as Martin Jugier or Ludwig Ott, who recognized that Palamas and his understanding of the divine being, the essence energies distinction, corresponds quite closely to the Scotistic Franciscan formal distinction between God's essence and his attributes or activities or properties. This is already rooted in the 15th century discussion at the Council of Florence. And in the West, one can trace a kind of radical divide in the appreciation of Palamas and the Byzantine Orthodox approach to God's being, along the lines of whether or not one is willing to affirm the Scotistic formal distinction, or whether or not one denies any possibility of such a distinction and opts instead for the Thomistic understanding of divine simplicity. So historically and contemporarily, this same divide obtains and is actually first rooted in the ecumenical discussions at the Council of Florence, and then the subsequent discussions between East and West, and theological developments in the East on the one hand, and then in disparate manners in the West between the main and dominant school of Thomism and the strong minority school of Duns Scotus. And what was seen, though, initially, and what we have to get into in this lecture, is that historically, the compatibility between East and West, between Palamas and the Latin theological tradition, was recognized as being possible in terms of the Franciscan school. However, in contemporary scholarship, such as the Schneider-edited Divine Essence and Divine Energies, the Franciscan school is not really seen as a live option, except to, on the one hand, either deny any continuity or similarity between Scotus's formal distinction and Gregory Palamas's real distinction between the divine essence and divine energies, or to criticize Palamas in virtue of the similarity between himself and Scotus. Finally, or perhaps not finally, another big deal of the Palamite school is it has implications for anthropology, spirituality, and eschatology. Because of the distinction between the divine essence and the divine manifestations through its uncreated energies, it states something about how man is to participate in God through these energies and the perfection of man in and through these uncreated divine energies. Thus, it gives a very robust and realistic, literalistic understanding of theosis or deification. And from this anthropology, it flows right into spirituality. Spirituality, the point of spirituality is for a real participation, a real communion with God in and through these divine energies, these uncreated energies that somehow interact synergistically with the person and his or her nature. And then finally, eschatologically, this distinction has certain implications for how one understands the beatific vision, Whereas in the West, especially again in the teaching of Aquinas, the formal cause of beatitude is simply the intellectual vision or apprehension of the divine essence as such. Thus, there's a kind of, it's more of a static knowing and seeing all at once. Whereas in the East, because the divine essence as such is essentially incomprehensible, beatitude itself will be a perfect participation in these uncreated energies, but the uncreated energies being inseparable from the divine essence, and the divine essence being infinite. These uncreated energies are infinite, and thus there is implied within the Eastern understanding of beatitude a perpetual progression, instability, a stable movement, or a moving rest, as St. Maximus the Confessor describes it, of the soul moving ever more deeply in and through these divine energies in relation to God, and deepening and intensifying in holiness, without, on the other hand, suffering any lack from ignorance or any possibility of volitional deviation from that stable movement or moving rest. And this understanding then has been called in the East, following St. Gregory of Nyssa and St. Maximus, epiktasis, this kind of eternal or sempiternal striving for God, even in the context of beatitude. So is Palamasm unique to the East? And one must admit that if Palamasm is taken in terms of its use of language, without considering the conceptual underpinnings of that language, then, especially with respect to the language of a real distinction between essence and energies, then one can say, yes, Palamasm is unique to the East. Moreover, one might say that the spirituality of hesychasm, one doesn't simply find a univocal counterpart in the West in terms of the robust understanding of the experience of the uncreated light under those very terms. However, one can say that in the West there are conceptual counterparts using other terms, but affirming the same basic metaphysical and conceptual framework, and if not emphasizing to the same degree the reality of the empirical or quasi-empirical experience of the uncreated light, still in the West you can find a very robust doctrine of participation and experience of God in his uncreated perfection, even if the emphasis lay more in terms of created signs and created habits, which are the manifestations in the created being of the divine and uncreated energies. So, on the one hand, you can say, yes, Palamas is unique to the East, but that's like simply saying Bonaventure or Scotus or Aquinas is unique to the West, and asking no further questions, refraining from asking whether or not they share common sources, they share a common deposit of faith, they share a common dogmatic framework, they share common concepts, even if they don't share a perfectly common and overlapping language. So on the one hand, then, I think it's a matter of translation, a kind of sympathetic translation of one tradition into the other and vice versa, and also an affirmation of the positive contributions that each tradition represented in Palamas in the West and St. Thomas, Palamas in the East, and St. Thomas and the Franciscan schools in the West, they represent unique insights, and that both theological traditions and ultimately both ecclesial communions have something to learn from the other, and would do well to try to integrate and harmonize the two approaches. Framed more carefully, then, we can ask the question, does the teaching of Palamas and his school set the East apart from the entirety of the West and represent an absolutely unique and exclusive set of insights? And I can say I don't think that's the case. And this lesson will argue that, in fact, Palamism doesn't represent this. But in order to show this, and this will be taken on more systematically in the next lecture after we kind of set the table for this more theological discussion by looking at the current major players or writers on this topic. So first, it requires, though, an approach to Palamas that is willing to read Palamas in light of his own successors and the manner in which the school of Palamas and his approach to the essence-energies distinction was clarified and expounded by his followers, especially Gennadius Scholarius, and Gennadius Scholarius' use of various Western distinctions. So it requires a hermeneutic, a manner of approaching Palamas that it wants to see Palamas as a consistent and coherent thinker, and it requires a willingness to translate terms into concepts and to see on the conceptual and metaphysical level a continuity that one might not find in its clarity in the specific terminology used. And then secondly, there must be a willingness to consider the Western intellectual tradition as broader than Thomas and his reception of Augustine. One also needs to look at other manners in which Augustine was received and integrated into a broader theological vision in the West. And the other main option in the West is the Franciscan school, in terms of a consistent, systematic, and or dogmatic theology. One might argue the case that the Jesuits also, in the figures of Suarez, or in more modern times in the figures of Karl Rahner and or Bernard Lonergan, also represent a viable option. But I think in terms of canonical recognition and authority and systematic consistency and method and depth, the Franciscan school is the only school that competes with the Thomistic paradigm on its own grounds, or at least that can measure up to the Thomistic paradigm in terms of depth, breadth, and consistency. And then finally, one can add that if one is to not see Palamas and the East set apart and set opposed to the West, in addition to taking an approach to Palamas that tries to read Palamas in a consistent manner, and then a willingness to consider the Western intellectual tradition as not being coextensive with St. Thomas, finally one has to be open to the fact that Palamas might just be compatible to the Western theological tradition. Now, this final position is more of an ethical or moral stance than a properly intellectual stance, because many groups and individuals on both sides of the debate see themselves as having something to lose by recognizing the harmony between Palamas and the Franciscan school. On the Greek side, it would undermine opposition between East and West on metaphysical and dogmatic grounds, because simply those grounds would no longer be present. Palamas is not absolutely unique and opposed to the West. And on the Western side, it would imply a recognition that in ecumenical discussion between our Byzantine Orthodox brethren, rather than St. Thomas, Duns Scotus and Bonaventure would hold pride of place in this discussion. So this would be a bitter pill to swallow, perhaps, for members of both sides of the debate. But I think if it can be shown that this read which I'm advocating is coherent and explains the data in a more elegant, consistent, and integrative manner, then I don't think it can be simply dismissed out of hand, but must rather be reckoned with by all parties. So in the first place, then, let's begin a quick run-through through the main figures as represented in Schneider's book, The Divine Essence and Divine Energies. And this will by no means do justice to the position of each scholar who presented, but I think can provide the main contours or main lines of argument, and thus help one locate the main loci of disagreement between East and West and the topics that remain of concern. So on the one hand, then, first beginning with Bradshaw, Bradshaw's main claim is that Palamas is a unique and neglected figure in the history of philosophy, and especially in the history of Western philosophy. He is unique insofar as he presents a unique account of being itself, that is, the divine being itself, in terms of this essence energies distinction. And this distinction itself has never been adequately appreciated or integrated into the history of philosophy. Now, in the first place, on conceptual grounds, Bradshaw's claim can be argued against or opposed. And in the second place, he's in the main right, and there are only few exceptions of philosophical studies or studies of the history of philosophy which take Palamas's contributions seriously. In the second place, Constantinos Athanasopoulos is much more pronouncedly, although he shares with Bradshaw a kind of anti-Augustino Thomism, he's much more pronounced in his understanding of this, and I think he makes some claims that are ill-founded and perhaps short-sighted or incomplete. In the first place, he claims that Palamas is the savior, or he claims to the effect that Palamas is the savior of Christian theology from the heretical Augustinian West, especially with respect to divine simplicity and the metaphysics embedded in the Western reception of Augustine through Aquinas. Moreover, he claims, and this is where he makes a mistake, he claims that Palamas simply had no use for St. Augustine. Well, on this claim, he's simply incorrect, and the research of John Dimitrakopoulos and Richard Flogaus and their coeval discovery of the presence of passages of Augustine's De Trinitate in St. Gregory's 150 chapters, shows that Athanasopoulos' claims about Palamas's anti-Augustinianism and the total absence of Augustine in his writings is just simply incorrect, so he's overstating the case. Thus, on the one hand, Palamas is using and approving of the writings and thought of St. Augustine, and he saw no need, therefore, to be a savior in any sense from St. Augustine, and moreover, by implication, the common Byzantine Orthodox notion of Augustine as the father of all heresies is simply not present in Palamas himself. Palamas, whose essence energies distinction is now seen to be the central and key metaphysical and dogmatic foundation for Eastern spirituality, anthropology, and theology. So, with Bradshaw and Constantinos, we find that Palamas is claimed to be both unique and exclusive, and in fact opposed to the predominant Augustinian West. We also find in the volume various Thomist conciliations, and this is a welcome sign, insomuch as we find Antoine Lévy seeing Palamas through the lens of St. Maximus the Confessor, being an essential continuity with the teachings of Thomas Aquinas. However, and as we point out in our article, Palamas amongst the Scholastics, Lévy is, in a sense, trying to extend Palamas into a realm of theological discourse, which it simply doesn't fit. There seems to be no compatibility here, because Thomas Aquinas' understanding of divine simplicity simply, no pun intended, excludes any objective distinction between God's essence and his energies or operations or properties. And what we pose in our critique of Lévy is simply to ask the question, is Lévy understanding both Palamas and Aquinas better than all of the Palamite and Thomistic theologians prior to Lévy's own writing? And this is a heavy burden to overcome. This is quite a burden of proof that I don't think Lévy actually, one, is able to motivate neutral, or even worse, unsympathetic hearers towards the correctness of his reading of either Aquinas or Palamas. And two, can he take upon himself the burden of overturning almost 700 years of theological reflection which sees an essential incompatibility with the metaphysics of Thomas Aquinas and the metaphysics of Palamas precisely on this point, the possibility and reality of a distinction in God between his essence and his energies. After Lévy's conciliatory approach between Palamas and Aquinas, we come to two figures who are both anti-Scotus, while one is pro-Palamas and the other is anti-Palamas, precisely because he's anti-Scotist. So in the first place, Nicholas Ludovicus objects strongly to any association of Palamas with Scotus along the lines that John Milbank will argue and has argued, and states very clearly that Palamas has nothing to do with Scotus's formal distinction, nor does Palamas have much, if anything, to do with the Augustinian tradition in the West in general. Unfortunately, for Ludovicus, his understanding of Scotus is based in faulty secondary literature and seems to indicate little, if any, direct interaction with Scotus himself. Unfortunately, then, for Ludovicus, because his knowledge of Scotus directly, that is, the real Scotus, is lacking, he fails to see how his own account of Palamas in defense against the criticisms of Milbank actually do in fact coincide with Scotus. For, like Scotus, Ludovicus sees Palamas as holding a notion of positive infinity with respect to the divine being. Moreover, he also understands that the distinction between essence and energy are not reducible on the one hand to a psychological distinction, nor are the essence and energies implicative of a real distinction or a separability between God's being or essence and his energies. And so what he's arguing against with respect to Milbank is, on the one hand, the understanding of Palamas's distinction and the pseudo-Scotistic distinction, according to Milbank, that the formal distinction between God's essence and his energies is merely a psychological distinction based upon latent realities in the Godhead that then manifest themselves in creation. In fact, according to Milbank's understanding of the formal distinction, we would have what is much closer to what we defined earlier as a distinction of reason or a mental distinction. So on the one hand, Ludovicus, like Scotus, wants to affirm there is an objective and real difference prior to the mind's consideration of the two multiple realities or quiddities under consideration. And also, on the other hand, he doesn't want to allow for any kind of real separation between God's essence and his energies. And a couple other interesting notes is that Ludovicus seems also to, with Scotus, hold to the more Maximian understanding of the ratio of creation as being found in the incarnation itself. That is what we've spoken of earlier as the absolute predestination of Christ. And so on another but related topic, we can find Ludovicus and Scotus, or Ludovicus's Palamas and Scotus, on the same basic page with respect to the objective distinction between God's essence and energies, or in the terms of Scotus, the formal distinction between God's essence, his intrinsic or interior infinity, and his properties via the formal distinction, not merely psychological. And also, we can also see in Ludovicus's interpretation and reception of Palamas an affirmation of the absolute predestination of Christ, which was articulated quite clearly in the Theology of Maximus the Confessor. So, on the one hand, then, with Ludovicus, we find an anti-Scotist yet pro-Palamas. However, his anti-Scotism is not based on any real Scotus, but on a specter of Scotus that has been put forward by John Milbank and Radical Orthodoxy. So now, on the other hand, let us move then to John Milbank himself. And rightly so, Milbank is known as anti-Scotistic and pro-Aquinas. Pro-Aquinas, though, in a manner that emphasizes Aquinas's the apophatic aspects of Aquinas' theology, a kind of push towards paradox and mystery that almost, if not actually, enters into a kind of contradiction. On the positive end, Milbank and his colleagues and disciples in the radical orthodoxy movement see accurately the true closeness between the Palamite school and the Franciscan school, inclusive of both Bonaventure and Scotus, in the application of what is equivalent to the formal distinction. That is, that distinction we spoke of earlier, that is with reference to distinct quiddities or entities really identical to a single being, and thus not independent or separable from one another or from the being in which these quiddities, I don't want to say in here, but which qualify these quiddities on the one hand, and on the other hand, these distinctions are objective and prior to the mind's activity. Milbank is correct to see the closeness in thought between the Franciscan and Palamite schools on this question with respect to the divine essence energies question. He is also correct to see how Palamas and Scotus both appeal to the distinct powers of the soul as an analogy to the essence energies distinction, because what you have, as we've mentioned earlier, we do have real identity and objective distinctness in both cases. Interestingly enough, Palamas borrows in his 150 chapters especially arguments from Augustine's De Trinitate, making this very point. So this is another aspect in which Palamas and the Franciscans are closely aligned. However, on the opposite side, Milbank and radical orthodoxy, and especially Milbank in the book that the Divine Essence, Divine Energies book, edited by Schneider, Milbank overplays his hand quite severely, while rightly noting the continuity between the Franciscan school, especially Scotus, but also Bonaventure and Palamas. With respect to the formal distinction, he completely misunderstands the nature of the formal distinction, because rather than, like with Scotus, seeing these distinct quiddities as actual and prior to and independent from the mind's consideration of them, Milbank views these entities as, quote, a kind of latent division within a real unity, permitting a real, if partial, separation on some arising occasion. Well, this formal distinction is completely wrong. For in the first place, the distinction between, say, God's wisdom and God's justice, or God's essence and his energies, is in no way latent, but perfectly actual. And it's this perfect actuality which gives the distinction between the various entities that are noted and not divided but discriminated through the formal distinction. It gives it's the very actuality of these realities that gives the formal distinction its epistemic and ontological purchase. So in no way are they latent. Moreover, division is ambiguous. Division can imply separation between parts rather than merely distinction without separation. And in fact, as we go on in our definition, Milbank says that this latent division within a real unity, well, first of all, a real unity is also ambiguous, because there are plenty of real unities with actual and latent divisions which admit of multiple instances of separability. But anyway, this latent division permits a real, if partial, separation. Well, of course, neither Palamas nor Scotus understand the distinction that they're employing when speaking of the essence and energies, or the essence and properties or operation of God, as a real and partial separation. No, there is no separation. That's the precise point of the formal distinction. So in both aspects of saying this refers to something latent and separable or separated, gets this entirely wrong. So Milbank, in misunderstanding the formal distinction, misunderstands and grossly misrepresents both Scotus and Palamas, and Ludovicus is right to object. Presuming that Milbank's account of Scotus is correct, then of course Ludovicus sees that Palamas has nothing to do with Scotus. The only problem is Milbank is entirely wrong on Scotus and the formal distinction. And then another point is John Milbank understands Scotus and his formal distinction as completely denying any possibility of participation. And this is more rooted in the implications of the formal distinction with respect to conceptual univocity and participation. If there is conceptual univocity, so Milbank reasons, there must be ontological univocity. Thus, any quality or activity a human person has, even under the influence of divine grace, because that divine grace is simply one, it's no longer a matter of participation, it's just a matter of collapsing of the transcendent into the immanent. Thus, this completely obviates participation in a transcendent being, because there is nothing truly transcendent. Or rather, if there is something transcendent, the transcendent quality is something participated equally by both God and creature, rather than the creature participating in God's transcendent through a perfection or a divine energy. So Milbank thinks that Scotus, and by implication Palamas, deny participation through their formal distinction and their at least implicit univocity, conceptual univocity of concepts when referring to perfections or energies in the manner in which human persons can participate. This is quite ironic because, of course, Palamas's whole understanding of the essence energies distinction was rooted in and flowed out of his desire to defend the holy hesychasts and that hesychastic and neptic ways of prayer that precisely was an affirmation, an empirical almost affirmation of participation in the divine and a kind of theosis understood in the most realistic sense. So it's important then, in understanding critiques of Scotus by those both in favor of and critical of Palamas, it's important to understand that often those critiques of Scotus don't quite hit the mark. And to the degree that such critiques don't hit the mark with respect to Scotus and then are applied to Palamas, to that extent, one's understanding of Palamas must also be incorrect as well. But then the question is this the whole story? Well, absolutely, it isn't the whole story. It's not even an adequate or representative account of existing scholarship, both theologically and historically, on the essence energies distinction. However, I think it is representative of the main trends, at least main published trends, of modern theological and historical scholarship in its understanding of Palamas and his place in the history of philosophy and theology and in relation to the Latin West. By and large, there exists today little to no commentary on the compatibility between the Franciscan school, even though certain aspects of this compatibility is recognized by many, especially with respect to the formal distinction, but little has been appreciated beyond that, on the one hand. And on the other hand, there's still dominant a kind of entrenched, and because entrenched, knee-jerk reaction against seeing Palamas as anything but absolutely unique in the East, and in the West as anything other than a kind of pantheistic mystic who botches any theological or metaphysical account of being and the divine being, because of his real distinction between essence and energies. And so in the next lecture, we will look at certain ways of approaching the teaching of Palamas, especially the divine essence energies question in relation to the Franciscan school, emphasizing the profound overlaps between both schools with respect to the doctrine of infinity, the use of the transcendental disjunctives, the use of the formal distinction, and the implicit spirituality that flows therefrom. And in sum, the next lesson will also put forward the notion that Palamas shouldn't be pitted simply against Aquinas, as though Aquinas is the sole representative of the Western theological view, when in fact there is a great deal of historical, canonical, and theological precedent to include the venerable Franciscan school in this discussion. And perhaps, if this is done, we might find that East and West on the question of Palamas and the essence energies distinction is much closer than was at first imagined.